Okay, so hobby loss rules. We had started out this chapter kind of talking about how it's important to distinguish between whether something is a hobby and whether something is a business. And of course, you can have hobbies turn into businesses, and you can also have businesses turn into hobbies. The big distinction is whether there's a profit motive or not. Everybody kind of has it in their mind that you gotta, after 3 years, you've gotta make a profit, or you're gonna get, they're gonna reclassify you as a hobby. Yes and no. Some businesses, especially considering the type of business as well as the environment that it's in. I mean, think about COVID and restaurants and stuff. I mean, between 2020 and 2023, I mean, obviously by 2023, most of them have recovered, but you know, there would have been a big span of time there when restaurants, legitimate businesses, were not making a profit, right? They just weren't making a profit because of the environment that they were operating in. And you know, you can think of other situations if stuff happened, you know, wars and I mean, hurricanes and things like that. Businesses will, for a long period of time, not be profitable. So it's all based on the facts and circumstances. I mean, those businesses wouldn't be reclassified as hobbies because they didn't make a profit after a few years, right? There are lots of different facts and circumstances that come into play. If you've got a motive, a profit motive is normally what the big distinguishing factor is. And the reason that we have this, that we have to distinguish between these two is because with a business, as you can see, with the income and expenses, you can have a loss with a business, right? And that loss then offsets other income on your tax return. For a legitimate business with a profit motive. With a hobby, you don't get that. You don't get to claim expenses more than your income. And the hobby losses or expenses, well, actually, you don't get to claim any expenses anymore. Again, this used to be classified under the other miscellaneous deductions on the Schedule A. It doesn't exist anymore. You still have to claim the income if you have a hobby, if you make income from it, but you don't get to claim any of the expenses against the hobby. Counter to that is you also don't have to pay any self-employment tax on that income for a hobby. But we need to distinguish between the two classifications because of those expenses. So here's an example. Alex, successful CPA, enjoys decorative woodworking. He makes decorative rocking chairs, tables, and other handcrafted furniture. Spends 10 to 15 hours a week, considerably less time during tax season, making the furniture, and had gross sales of $3,000. His expenses for the year were $10,000. If the activity is treated as a trade or business, he would have a $7,000 loss, which would offset his other income. If it's a hobby, then he would have none of those expenses would be allowed, but he'd still have to pay tax on the $3,000. So big difference for Alex. So how do we determine? What are the different factors that are used to determine whether something is a hobby or a business? These are just some of the factors that could be used. And this, of course, would come into play if the IRS came in and started to question whether or not your business is actually a hobby. So the manner in which the taxpayer carries on the activity, the expertise of the taxpayer or their advisors, and no one of these is definitive, right? It would all facts and circumstances would be taken into account. The time and effort expended by the taxpayer to carry on the activity, expectation that assets used in the activity can appreciate in value, and that one's kind of tough too. I mean, most assets, unless it's a building, don't appreciate, they depreciate, right? Success of the taxpayer in carrying on other similar or dissimilar activities, their history of income or losses with respect to the activity. So there's that, you know, after so many years, that might be one factor to look at, but it's not going to be defining factor. The amount of occasional profits, if any, that are earned, taxpayer's financial status, and then the elements of personal pleasure or recreation. All of the facts and circumstances are taken into account No one factor is controlling. IRS will assert that an activity is a hobby. If the IRS asserts that an activity is a hobby, the burden of proof is on the taxpayer to prove that it's not a hobby. So you want to keep records. So, you know, like, do you advertise for whatever product it is? Even if it's like, you know, social media advertising, that sort of thing. Do you, do you just do what other businesses do? Do you have a separate business banking account for that business? Do you, how much time and effort do you expend at it, and that sort of thing. So, for example, think about like all the places you see at the farmer's market, right? A lot of those things that they sell could be considered really a hobby if they're not doing it on a regular basis, and if their intent is really not to make a profit. Maybe they just like making apple pies, right? And they want to get enough money back in so that they can buy more supplies to make more pies, and they get to meet and greet with all sorts of people. They're very social. That would not be a business, really. As opposed to, you make apple pies and you're really good at making apple pies, and you realize that that's, you could make some money off of it. And so you start putting effort into it, and you start spending more and more time at making those pies and having so now you're not just at the farmer's market, you're also selling it to local coffee shops to have as, and that sort of thing. I'm sorry, I'm hungry, so I'm thinking about but anyway, so it's not just one single thing that would determine that. It's lots of different things. Education expense, or any questions about the hobby stuff? Okay. So education is kind of interesting because there are a couple different types of education, right? There are education expenses that are for like continuing education, and then there are education expenses to maybe train you in a different line of work, right? Those education expenses that are used to further your skills in this job, so for example, CPA, you have to have 40 hours of continuing education every year, it's a requirement of the job. Any expenses toward keeping that certification would be considered deductible education expenses. They would be considered ordinary and necessary. It's part of, you can't continue in the profession if you don't do it, right? That's not necessarily a requirement that the education has to be, critical in that you can't continue in the profession, but it has to be related to the profession that you are in. So that kind of education could certainly be considered deductible, ordinary, and necessary business expense. But if it's something like, okay, you're a CPA and you decide that you're interested in woodworking, so you take some woodworking classes, well, that's not that doesn't do anything to maintain your education in this particular job, and so that would not be a deductible expense. So they've got to meet these correct criteria. If it maintains or improves skills required by the individual in his or her employment or other trade or business. So there has to be a business, like if you got it woodworking, like that example with the CPA person, if that woodworking job actually was a trade or business, then yeah, you could take classes in woodworking and it would be deductible on that Schedule C. You can have multiple Schedule Cs, by the way. As many businesses as you want, each of them has a Schedule C. Meets the express requirements of the individual's employer or the requirements of applicable law or regulation. This one you can kind of scratch out because you can't be an employee and then deduct these expenses because, like I said, that's no longer deductible. But like my example of the CPA, requirements of applicable law or regulation, that's a regulation in order to maintain that. Education, even if they meet that though, the education expenses are not deductible if the education is required to meet minimal educational requirements for employment, or if the education qualifies the taxpayer for a new trade or business. So if it's like a bachelor's degree sort of thing, where like if your employer, well, again, it's employer trying to think of an example of this. If the education is required to meet minimum educational requirements for employment. Okay, so the CPA, I'm not a CPA yet, but I've got an accounting business. Well, that doesn't really count. I want to be a CPA, so I started doing some accounting. So I go to school, get my bachelor's degree, and then get my master's degree in accounting to open up that business. That's separate. That's from, even though if I'm doing bookkeeping, it's related to it, it's not, like if my minimum educational requirements to be a CPA are those others, and I didn't have it before. That kind of makes sense. That's kind of an obscure, it doesn't really happen very often, so it's hard for me to think about an example of that. But any education that would qualify the taxpayer for a new trade or business. So I'm a CPA, I go back to school, to law school to become an attorney. That's qualifying me for a new trade or business. That education would not count. Here we go. So Leon is a CPA who's been practicing for 10 years in audit. He decides that he would like to start a tax practice. He begins taking classes in a Master of Tax program. Are the expenses deductible? The answer here is yes, because the education does not qualify Leon for a new profession, so it's still under the accounting umbrella. Education only improves his skills in the CPA profession for which he already qualifies. But if he were an attorney practicing, it would depend on his practice area, really. If he was an attorney practicing in the area of taxation, because tax is law, then that still might count as deductible. Education expenses include tuition, books, supplies, fees, and travel. Those other things, those other items, which we'll learn about in chapter 9, those other educational, like here, Leon, if he went back to school to become an attorney, if it didn't qualify, he still may be eligible for like the lifetime learning credit or something else for his education. So there are other opportunities to get deductions and tax benefits from those. All right, questions? All right.